Alright folks, tonight we're diving into the shadowy, rough-edged, and decidedly unglamorous world of medieval contract killers. These were the figures who slipped through castle corridors and back-alley darkness, nudging history along with a quiet step and a sharp blade. Movies love to make them look slick and mysterious, but the truth? Being a hired killer in the Middle Ages was a miserable business. So, before we get too cozy, tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy the stuff I put out here. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this little community stretching across time zones and continents. Now, go ahead and dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and settle in for tonight's tale. Here's the thing, no one in medieval Europe woke up and thought, you know what? I'd love to jam a dagger into a nobleman's neck for 12 silver coins and the privilege of hiding inside a barrel for 3 days. This wasn't a dream job, it was the final stop on the life went very, very wrong train. The reality? Most assassins weren't mystical loners trained in mountaintop temples. They were desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, former thieves with steady hands, or people so far off society's radar they could kill a man and no one would even notice on the census. If you had wealth, land, or even just a goat, you didn't become an assassin, you hired one. You were management. But if you'd just broken out of some lord's dungeon, had a knack for solving problems, and could slip into a tavern without drawing eyes, congratulations. Sooner or later, someone was going to slide a coin purse across the table and whisper a name. And it was never Bob the turnip farmer. It was always someone dangerous, a corrupt baron, a gold-hoarding bishop, or a man with a moat and a dozen armed guards. The payment might sound tempting. The work? Horrifying. By the time anyone considered it, they had nothing left. No family, no future, no dental plan. And let's not pretend there were perks. No pension. No glory. No holidays. You couldn't exactly hang a sign outside your door reading "Quiet Eliminations, by appointment only." Your whole existence relied on staying unseen, moving fast, and never bragging about your line of work, especially not loudly over drinks. So no one dreamed of becoming a medieval assassin. They ended up there because life chewed them up, spat them out, and left them in a hood with a rusted dagger. You weren't a hero, and you weren't even the main villain. You were the nervous footnote in someone else's story, and odds were, you wouldn't live long enough to spend your payment. Let's smash our first myth right here. There was no candlelit monastery with wise old mentors, no inspiring flute music montage. There was no teacher, no motivational pep talk. If you learned anything, it was because you somehow didn't die the first few times you tried. Most assassins weren't polished professionals. They were rough amateurs who happened to know which end of the knife to hold and could climb a wall without coughing. If you'd been in the army, you had a head start. You already knew how to stab properly. If not, stabbing was straightforward. Getting out afterward with all your organs intact. That took real skill, or dumb luck. Usually luck. There were no training manuals, no guild initiation, no safety briefings. No one taught you how to spot a body double or where nobles kept their secret exits. You figured it out mid-job, clinging to a window ledge, praying you hadn't just crawled into the wrong bedroom. Poisons? Pure trial and error, with the emphasis on error. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes your target just got a little woozy and suspicious of his stew. Sometimes you ended up drinking the wrong cup. No medieval poison hotline, just herbal guesswork and the ability to keep your lunch down. If you got lucky, and I mean find a bag of gold in a ditch, lucky, you might pick up tips from a thief or mercenary. Maybe an older killer showed you how to walk without your boots squeaking. But mentoring wasn't common, and it wasn't long-term. Assassins didn't retire, they simply disappeared. Longevity in this line of work was rare and brief, because assassins didn't retire. They simply vanished. Weapon training? Forget it. You weren't swinging some grand broadsword. You had a dagger lifted from a guard, maybe a garrote if you were feeling ambitious, and whatever else could fit under your cloak without rattling like a toolbox. So no, you weren't some mystical master of shadow combat. You were just a person with rough palms, quiet footfalls, and an unhealthy familiarity with narrow back alleys. Success wasn't born from elegant practice. It was scraped together from sheer survival. You learned by doing, fast, messy, and disappearing before anyone could sketch your face and nail it to a chapel door. Your school was brutal, the lessons purely practical, and graduation came with no parchment, just bruises, bloodstains, and the slow, cold truth that you were completely on your own. So why take up this trade at all? One word: coin. Heavy, cold, beautifully spendable coin. The promise of it is what lured you in. But the truth? You got paid in false promises. Clients never wanted a long-term partnership. They wanted a single service, no records, and preferably no witnesses, including you. They'd dangle a pouch of silver, half up front, half on completion, if they were in a generous mood. But on completion usually meant after they were sure you hadn't botched the job, left evidence, made them look foolish, or, worst of all, lived long enough to speak about it. So you do the job, slip through shadows, gamble with your life, maybe put a dagger in a baron's ribs while he slept. Not glamorous. Not poetic. And when you return for payment, oh, how unfortunate, the employer had vanished. Or better yet, they tried to save money by sticking you with the knife. Even if you were paid, it never covered the risk, the blood, or the 3 flea-bitten nights you spent hiding in a hayloft wondering if this was worth it. And sometimes the whole contract was a setup. You'd be sent to eliminate some dangerous target, only to find it was a decoy flanked by guards. Congratulations, you just walked into a sting, your name already etched into the gallows post. And you couldn't exactly appeal to the local magistrate. Your Honor, I wish to file a breach of contract suit against Lord Branton for unpaid murder fees. The only court you'd see was the one deciding how best to hang you. So you learned fast. Demand as much as you could in advance and trust no one. Not the middleman, not the scribe, not even the friend who swore this would change your life. It did, mainly by shortening it. Being an assassin meant existing on broken deals and slipping away before they broke you. Now let's talk equipment. Forget fantasy novels or game-inspired gadgets. There were no hidden wrist blades, smoke pellets, enchanted knives, or compact folding crossbows tucked in your boots. Your kit was whatever you could steal, sharpen, and hide without making a sound. If fortune smiled, and by fortune I mean stumbling across a gold coin in a dead man's boot, you might get yourself a decent dagger. Not elegant, not carved with dragon motifs, just sharp, relatively rust-free, and ideally free of the last victim's smell. Poisons? They existed, yes, but far from glamorous. Most were crude mixtures of plants, minerals, or animal parts. Some worked fast, some took hours, and some simply left the target sick and furious, now doubly suspicious of their stew. Ropes? Handy, but only if you knew what you were doing. Nothing ruined a job like fumbling a knot mid-struggle. Bows? Useful, sure. If you had one, could shoot it, and weren't expected to smuggle it into a lord's keep disguised as a flower arrangement. But most kills weren't distant or theatrical. They were personal, immediate, and ideally silent. Just enough space to slip in. That was all you got. And you didn't have spares. If your blade bent, broke, or took an unexpected trip down a well, you improvised. Roof slate? That'll do. Rusty nail? Worth a try. A shoe buckle if you swung it with enough bad intentions? Desperate times. You kept your tools hidden, tucked into hems inside boots, or even hollowed out loaves of bread. And you didn't keep them close for comfort. You kept them close because in this profession your weapon was your best friend, your employer, and your pension plan all rolled into one. There were no shiny upgrades, no tinkering between jobs. You didn't polish your kit, you just prayed it didn't betray you mid-strike. Because in the end it wasn't the steel that got the job done, it was you. You underprepared, under-equipped, and expected to pull off miracles with a spoon and a whispered curse. And your contracts? Nobody was paying you to shiv a drunk in a side alley. You weren't here to scare Jeff the sleepy candle maker. Your assignments were the big fish, nobles, bishops, military commanders, sometimes even royals. And those were the hardest to reach. First problem, the guards. Not just one or two, dozens. Armed, armored, and fed better than you ever were. Some guarded the gates, some patrolled the halls, and some just stood there like statues, daring you to blink wrong. You'd spend days learning their routines, which doors creaked, and exactly how many steps it took before the wheezing night guard needed a breather. Second problem, walls. Castles didn't welcome visitors. They had portcullises, murder holes, and moats filled with things that wanted to eat you. Even if you didn't drown, there were arrow slits and boiling oil to consider. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description might as well have read, occupational hazard, possible flambeing for curiosity. Third, the servants. Cooks, scribes, stable boys, any of them could ruin you. One suspicious glance and they'd be whispering to the captain of the guard before you could mutter, "I'm just the herbalist." In truth, you weren't just avoiding swords, you were dodging gossip. And in the medieval world, gossip could outrun a horse if it meant keeping one's own head attached. And finally, your target. Always paranoid. Always right to be. They lived surrounded by schemers, relatives with legal claims, and a retinue of fake smiles. They didn't eat without a food tester. They didn't sleep without triple locking their door. Some rotated bedrooms nightly or kept decoy beds like a homicidal version of musical chairs. Feasts sounded tempting. Yes, they'd be drunk, but so would you. And you'd still need to get past royal guards, a pack of dogs, an unusually observant jester, and 50 witnesses clutching mugs. Even reaching them could take weeks of preparation, posing as a servant, bribing a maid, hiding in a barrel. And when that moment finally came, you had one shot. One clean, quiet, perfect strike, and then vanish into the night. Miss, and you'd end up as the castle's newest lawn ornament, swinging from the gate with a helpful sign reading, "Nice try." And about your look? Let's drop the fantasy. No sleek black robes, no custom leather bracers, no majestic hood blowing in the wind. Reality? You looked like a goat herder who'd had a bad week. Disguises weren't glamorous, they were whatever you could scavenge. Peasant rags, an oversized monk's robe, or half of a guard's uniform that still smelled suspiciously like its last wearer. Blending in didn't mean looking mysterious, it meant looking like everyone else. Unwashed, limping from old wounds and twitchy from hunger. Masks? Forget it. No elegant options. Most face coverings just made you look contagious, which was great for avoiding conversation but less ideal for gate access. If someone asked who you were, you had to improvise fast. Brother Matthew, silent prayer and roof repairs. And even if you got inside, noble households weren't full of idiots. Servants noticed outsiders, especially ones who fumbled chamber pots and couldn't name the Lord's favorite hunting dog. One wrong word, one curious servant, or the cook's cat brushing against your leg at the wrong moment, and suddenly you're one, "I've never seen you before" away from getting your skull introduced to a brass candlestick. And if your disguise actually worked? Congratulations. You now had to maintain the act for hours while pretending you weren't surrounded by half a dozen people who looked very stab-worthy. Wicks, not a thing. If you needed to aid yourself, you rubbed soot on your face, squinted, and prayed nobody got close enough to notice your beard was stuck on with honey. Disguises didn't protect you. They bought you maybe 5 minutes of uncertainty. After that, you either vanished, became invisible, or convinced everyone in the room that you absolutely belonged there. If you failed, no one wants to be caught in the bishop's laundry room, dressed as a nun, holding a sword, especially not on a feast day. There was no team in this line of work. No helpful crossbow-wielding sidekick. No eccentric alchemist brewing smoke bombs in a secret cellar. No handler sending you coded notes with warm words of encouragement. There was you, a rusty blade, and trust issues so severe they could be listed as a chronic illness. Assassin guilds weren't a reliable network. They were mostly ale-soaked tavern rumors. You were more likely to bump into a ghost than another professional killer willing to swap trade tips. Isolation wasn't just a habit, it was survival. The fewer people who knew you existed, the more days you got to keep breathing. Even your client might not know your real name, and if they did, you were already mapping the fastest route out of the city. Friends? Laughable. Friends asked questions. Lovers noticed bruises, blood stains, and why you slept with your hand on a knife under the pillow. One slip, a merchant recognizing you in the marketplace, and suddenly your life turned into a sprint toward the nearest sewer entrance. Even fellow criminals kept you at arm's length. Thieves liked company. Smugglers liked conversation. You were the one who made people disappear. Nobody wanted to share stew with a walking torch magnet. And forget sympathy. You couldn't confess how hard it was to sleep after strangling a corrupt bishop in the dark. Say it out loud and people would assume you were lying, dangerous, or both, none of which earned you friends. So you kept your scars, your stories, and your weapons to yourself. At inns, you sat in the corner with your back to the wall, eyes on the door, never drinking enough to dull your senses, never staying more than a night. You didn't give your name unless there was coin involved, and even then it probably wasn't the real one. Being a medieval assassin meant mastering the art of vanishing, not just into a crowd but from entire lives you never got to live. And failure? That wasn't an option. You could plan the perfect route, bribe the right guard, and slip in as a chimney sweep so convincing you smelled like one. But if the target turned unexpectedly, if they had a child with them, if your hand trembled at the wrong second, you were dead. Not career over dead. Actually dead. Publicly. Spectacularly. And with enough medieval creativity to make future criminals think twice. Ropes, fire, wheels, iron contraptions with names like the Bonecracker's Delight. Missed the strike, and your target lived long enough to describe you to every guard and barkeep within 30 miles. That crude charcoal sketch on the tavern wall? That's you. The guards you once slipped past? Now they're motivated. And sometimes the real danger wasn't even your target, it was your employer. Fail and you weren't a useful blade anymore. You were a liability. And the first person to put out another contract on you would be the one who hired you in the first place. There were no do-overs. No polite, oops, blade slipped, better luck tomorrow. You had one chance, one heartbeat, and if you botched it, your best hope was a swift death before anyone could trace the job back to your employer. Failure wasn't just dangerous, it was humiliating. You hadn't simply missed your mark, you'd failed at being unseen, at being flawless. And in this profession, flawless was the only acceptable standard. Anything less might as well paint a bullseye on your back. Your track record didn't matter. No one cared that you'd pulled off a dozen perfect kills before. In this line of work, you were only as good as your most recent job, and if that job had gone wrong, you'd better already be halfway to the next kingdom. But let's say it didn't go wrong. Let's say you nailed it. One quiet strike, no shouts, no clattering armor, just a body crumpling to the floor and a very important person now, not breathing. Congratulations. Now run. Because successful assassin didn't mean relaxing on a rooftop, sipping wine while chaos unfolded below. It meant sprinting down alleys with blood on your boots while a dog caught your scent. There was no victory drink, no debrief, no friendly pat on the back from your client. The moment the blade hit, your new mission began. Escape. Guards on alert, doors locked, gates closing, and horses inconveniently stabled on the other side of the city. You might already be bleeding. That's why you plan the exit before the kill. Routes, disguises, backup hideouts. Maybe a boatman you'd bribed in advance, someone who didn't ask questions. Because within minutes, the city would be locked down, and every guard would have your description along with a note reading, armed and extremely dangerous. As for your client, if they intended to pay you at all, they weren't sticking around for tea and thanks. They'd disappear too, because an assassin fresh from a kill is the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much. You'd proven you could get in anywhere. So even when you succeeded, you left with two things: a pouch of coins and a giant invisible target on your back. Your reward? A week of hiding in barns, bribing ferrymen, shaving in the dark, and passing yourself off as Brother Lucian while trudging east with a group of monks. Success didn't mean safety. It meant starting over in a new city, under a new name, with even more people looking for you than before. And if that wasn't miserable enough, being broke, hunted, and sleeping in places that smelled like livestock, you also had to deal with medieval paranoia. Assassins weren't just feared, they were considered cursed. To most villagers, you weren't a man with a knife, you were some unholy thing that consorted with demons and smeared frog guts on steel under a full moon. Why else could you sneak past guards and melt into the night? Logic wasn't popular then, but superstition? That was everywhere. Some swore assassins could change shape. Others believed you were invisible unless doused with holy water. One favorite tale said you'd struck bargains with forest spirits and could kill with a single breath through a wall. Walk through a market and you might hear someone hiss, "Don't look at him, he'll curse the baby." Even your tools were suspect. A dagger? Clearly forged in accursed fire. Poison? Not chemistry, witchcraft, probably brewed while chanting under a blood moon. You'd think that kind of fear would keep people away from you. But mobs driven by superstition don't keep their distance. They close in fast. They don't ask for proof. They throw stones. They light torches. And they make sure whatever they think you are doesn't live long enough to prove them wrong. They'd shout things like, "Burn him before he calls down the storm." Your reputation alone was enough to set people off. The moment someone died in an unusual way, whether from sickness, an accident, or choking on a chicken bone, someone would mutter, "Maybe it was a shadow man. Maybe it was him." That whisper was all it took for you to become the next target. You could be hunted simply for existing in the same village where a suspicious death occurred, which meant you never stayed anywhere too long. Linger for a few extra days and suddenly a priest is tolling the bell while half a dozen farmers grip pitchforks like they've been rehearsing for this moment their entire lives. And heaven forbid you were caught with anything strange, dried plants, odd-looking coins, or even an unfamiliar accent. That was enough to make someone scream, "Sorcerer," and grab the nearest torch. In a world where people believed monsters wore human faces, being too clever, too quiet, or too quick marked you as dangerous. And in medieval thinking, dangerous things needed to be killed fast, and ideally while on fire. Poison, the assassin's refined weapon. In theory it was clean, discreet, and silent. A sip, a stagger, a quiet gasp, and it's done. In reality, poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a sword fight using herbal tea and sarcasm. Poisons back then were anything but precise. You didn't have neat glass vials of purified death. You had plants, mushrooms, minerals, maybe the occasional toxic toad. You'd crush, grind, mix, and hope for the best. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it gave your target a stomachache and a story to tell his guards. There was no measuring exact doses, you guessed. Too little, and the mark simply vomited and skipped dessert. Too much, and you might poison yourself before they took the first bite. And slipping the stuff into their food was an art form in itself. Medieval kitchens were bustling chaos. You couldn't just stroll in and sprinkle nightshade on the stew. You'd have to bribe a cook, disguise yourself as one, or sneak in unseen, only to discover the dish would be sampled by 3 tasters and yes, even a dog before it touched the noble's lips. And highborn meals weren't meals. They were security events. The food was sniffed, blessed, tested, and examined by everyone from the steward to the jester. If you actually got the poison in and it wasn't discovered and the target ate it, well then came the waiting game. Might take hours. Might take days. One moment they'd be laughing at a joke and the next clutching their stomach and summoning the court astrologer. If they survived, they'd be looking for someone to blame. Not the cook. Not the tasters. You, the strange, quiet figure with the suspicious knowledge of herbs. Poisoning wasn't clean or efficient. It was unpredictable, slow, and full of ways for things to go wrong. And if you were caught, forget a quick death, you'd be questioned until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the duke to his hunting hound. You'd think that taking out a tyrant, ending a royal bloodline, or silencing a dangerous rival would win you a place in the history books. But no, being an assassin meant your name was never meant to last. At best, you became a whisper, a faceless rumor, a hooded foreigner with cold eyes, or the quiet man in the tavern who never finished his drink. You could pull off the most daring kill of the century and still vanish into the footnotes of history. Your clients didn't want a story, they wanted silence. The fewer people who knew who did it, the safer they were from ending up on your list. Your name, if you even used a real one, was buried with the body. No trophies. No bragging. No trace you'd ever existed beyond that single, perfect moment. And if someone did know your name, that was a loose end. And in your world, loose ends didn't live long. As for honor, forget it. There were no awards for disappearing. No monuments for the shadow who ended a war with one well-placed strike. When nobles wanted to be remembered, they built statues of themselves. If you were lucky, you got a plain wooden box and an unmarked grave. If you were unlucky, your head ended up on a spike with "Traitor" painted beneath it in crude letters. Sometimes your name survived only so it could be cursed, used as a warning whispered over drinks, "Don't cross the king. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich? And the man who made it happen. Gone like smoke." That was your legacy. Not glory, not fear, but absence. You weren't meant to leave a mark, you were meant to disappear. And the moment you became recognizable, you'd already made your last mistake. In the medieval world, heroes got remembered. Assassins got erased. So let's say you pulled it off. You completed the job, you even got paid, which was practically a miracle. All that was left was to keep your head down and trust your client to keep their promise. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. Because if the first rule of medieval assassination was don't get caught, the second, far more important, was never trust the one paying you. Nobles, merchants, bishops with ambitions sharper than their morals, they didn't hire you out of respect. They hired you because you were useful. And once you'd done the dirty work, you stopped being useful and started being dangerous. You knew who they wanted dead, when, and why. You knew the price they were willing to pay. That made you a threat not just to their enemies, but to them. So what happened? Sometimes they vanished, denying they'd ever spoken to you. Other times they hired someone else to tie off the contract, preferably with steel instead of ink. It wasn't rare for a client to double book. One assassin for the target, another for the assassin. No refunds, just fewer loose ends. And if you were foolish enough to try blackmail? Congratulations, you just made your final move. Medieval power players didn't bargain with assassins. They erased them. Even an honorable employer, if such a thing existed, would keep you under watch, knowing that anyone who could kill for them could also kill them. Let's pretend you beat the odds. You dodged every blade, avoided every betrayal, and somehow outlived your enemies. What then, retire? No chance. Assassins didn't get pensions or seaside cottages. There was no warm farewell feast, no final payment for years of loyal service. You either disappeared or you died, often in that order. Even if you walked away, your past didn't. You carried too many secrets, too many names, too much blood. People didn't want you retired, they wanted you erased. And even if no one came for you, which was a big if, you lived with the constant certainty that someone might. Some young killer eager to make his mark could be holding a contract with your description on it right now. So you became someone else. You changed your name. Moved to a quiet village where no one asked questions. Limped a little, sold herbs, claimed you used to be a guard. But you never slept easy. You chose your seat in the tavern so you could see the door. You kept a dagger hidden beneath the floorboards, right beside a pouch of coins you never spent because they still smelled of the man you took them from. And worst of all, you stopped trusting yourself. Years of silent killings and narrow escapes had rewired your instincts. Every knock at the door made you tense. Every stranger's gaze lingered too long. You stopped dreaming entirely. Because dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love. You couldn't relax. You couldn't laugh without glancing over your shoulder. You existed like a phantom wearing human skin. The truth? A medieval assassin had no grand finale, just a slow, cold fade into obscurity. Always on the move, always watching, until one night you slipped away into darkness and no one even noticed. And maybe that was the best you could hope for. By now, it's clear, being an assassin in the Middle Ages wasn't some brooding romantic fantasy. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even a solid way to make money. It was a brutal, thankless, short-lived trade, stitched together with blood and shadow, followed by a line of people eager to see you gone. You wouldn't survive, not for a week, maybe not for a single day, because you'd walk in with the wrong idea. You'd think you'd be sleek, in control, a ghost in the night. But in reality, you'd be cold, hungry, and one bad decision away from a rope around your neck. You'd slip into town with your cloak pulled tight, ready for the kill, only to learn your mark had moved locations. The guards? Drunk but eager to spill blood. The stable boy you bribed? Already sold your name for a mug of ale and a chunk of bread. You'd hesitate at the wrong moment. Dick the wrong man. Get spotted by a maid who swears she saw you loitering near the chapel last week. Suddenly you're not the shadow, you're the problem. And then you'd run. But you're not used to the reality of medieval streets, thick mud, uneven cobblestones, and an absurd number of loose chickens underfoot. You'd slip, crash to the ground, and find yourself pinned by a guard named Thomas, fresh from a bad breakup and desperate for a fight. Let's pretend you lived through that. You'd still be left with nothing. No allies, no honor, no future. Just rumors, suspicion, and the creeping knowledge that even if you won, the best ending you'd get was to die alone under a false name in a backwater village that still told fairy tales. No, you wouldn't last. And you shouldn't try. Because the assassin's life wasn't thrilling, it was a meat grinder for the soul, chewing up lives and spitting out shadows. It promised power without safety, purpose without belonging. You didn't write history, you erased yourself from it. And what waited at the end was nothing but silence. A silence no one would question because no one remembered you existed. Before she became the feared queen of Macedonia, Olympias was known as Myrtale, a Meletian princess from the wild, mountainous lands of Epirus. Her people claimed the blood of Achilles flowed in their veins. Whether that was truth or legend, one thing was certain. This was not a woman destined for the quiet edges of history. From childhood, Myrtale's world was steeped in prophecy, ritual, and the will of ancient gods. Her upbringing was shaped as much by sacred rites as by politics. She wasn't the kind of princess who sat smiling over embroidery. She was drawn instead to omens, serpents, and the frenzied dances of the Dionysian cult. Rituals where women moved barefoot beneath the moon, calling upon the divine in states of ecstatic trance. Her bond with the gods was not for show, it was visceral. She didn't just worship, she embodied. Ancient accounts, mostly from men both fascinated and unnerved, claimed she kept sacred snakes in her chambers, even letting them coil beside her in bed. Was this truth, or the kind of scandal powerful women attract like flies? No one can say. But the image stuck. To her followers, it made her sacred. To her enemies, it made her dangerous. Her influence began not in a throne room or on a battlefield, but in the flicker of torchlight, in whispered prayers, and in the coiling shadows of snakes. She was more than a princess, she was a living prophecy, a figure touched by forces older than crowns and colder than steel. So when Philip II of Macedon, brutal, brilliant, and famously insatiable, came to the island of Samothrace for a sacred initiation, he didn't just meet a striking young royal. He met a riddle draped in silk. Their marriage was no ordinary alliance, it was a collision of ambition and destiny. And from the very beginning it was volatile. Assassinated. It happened in 336 BCE, during the wedding celebrations of his daughter Cleopatra, not the Macedonian wife, but his own child, to King Alexander of Epirus, Olympias's own brother. The court was in full splendor, the air thick with wine, music, and ambition. And then, in a moment no one saw coming, Philip II was struck down by one of his own bodyguards, Pausanias, in front of the entire Macedonian elite. The official story claimed it was personal revenge. But the truth? In Macedon, personal and political were never separate. And if you looked closely enough, the shadows around that murder seemed to stretch in one very particular direction. Back toward Epirus. Olympias wasted no time. Within days she swept back into Macedon, her absence transformed into an advantage. Now widowed, she positioned herself as the grieving queen mother, the guardian of Alexander's destiny. And she moved fast. Her first target was Cleopatra Eurydice, Philip's young Macedonian wife, and her newborn child. Both were threats to Alexander's claim, and Olympias was not in the habit of leaving threats alive. Ancient accounts, again written mostly by men who both feared and hated her, say Olympias had Cleopatra and her baby executed, some claiming she forced the young queen to hang herself after watching her child die. Whether these details were truth, embellishment, or pure propaganda, one fact is certain. After Philip's death there was no rival heir. Only Alexander remained. With her son now king at just 20 years old, Olympias's role shifted. She became not just his mother but his political co-architect. While Alexander marched east to carve his name into history, she ruled in his absence, maneuvering through palace intrigue with the precision of a snake in the grass. She wrote him letters filled with advice, warnings, and perhaps a touch of prophecy. Some say she meddled too much. Others say she was the only one in Macedon truly loyal to him. And yet, her story was never going to be a gentle one. Olympias understood something most people spend their lives avoiding: power was never safe. It was something you held with clenched fists, teeth bared, and eyes always searching the shadows. And for years she held it. But like every player in Macedon, she also knew that one day the game would turn. Philip II was cut down at his daughter's wedding, just as he stood on the brink of invading Persia, poised to crown himself not only king of Macedon but possibly ruler of the known world. The question that raced through every marble corridor and torchlit hall was the same. Who was behind it? Was it Pausanias, the scorned bodyguard who struck the fatal blow? Was it the work of shadowy court politics? Could it have been Alexander himself? Or, spoken only in whispers, was it Olympias? No one could prove it. Few dared even to try. But many believed it. And within mere days, Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant daughter were dead, killed, some said, at Olympias's command. The serpent had returned to the palace, and now nothing stood between her son and the throne. As Macedon reeled in mourning and confusion, Olympias moved with precision. While others stumbled through the chaos, she acted, swiftly, ruthlessly, decisively. Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen and direct threat to Alexander's succession, was dealt with first. Ancient accounts claim Olympias made her death more than a killing, it was a statement. Some sources allege she forced Cleopatra to take her own life after witnessing her child's murder. Others say the baby was cast onto a blazing pyre. Whatever the exact truth, one fact is certain: mercy had no place here. Olympias understood what so many royal mothers refused to face. In the palace, compassion is weakness, and a rival child is the seed of a future war. With Cleopatra and her bloodline erased, the way to the throne was clear. Her teenage son, bold, brilliant, trained by Aristotle himself, was declared king without serious challenge. But his ascension owed as much to his mother's lethal politics as to his father's legacy. Olympias knew which generals to intimidate, which nobles to charm, and which enemies to quietly erase. She wasn't just defending Alexander's claim, she was forging it. Alexander himself was uneasy. He reportedly disapproved of the bloodshed surrounding Cleopatra's family, but he didn't stop it. Deep down, he knew what Olympias had always known. In Macedon, power is never won without blood, and bloodlines are as dangerous as they are precious. Once her son was crowned, Olympias stepped back from the stage, or so it seemed. In truth, she simply shifted from public strikes to quiet maneuvering. As Alexander prepared to lead his army east into Persia, she stayed behind, not as a passive queen mother, but as the guardian of his fate. She sent him sacred relics, sought omens, and performed rituals in his name. To Olympias, his campaign was no mere war, it was the fulfillment of prophecy. And as long as she lived, no rival, Macedonian, Persian, or otherwise, would stand in his way. Her official role may have been queen mother, but in practice she ruled in all but title. The regency fell nominally to Antipater, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, but Olympias refused to be sidelined. She flooded Alexander with letters, missives that were less maternal comfort and more political counsel, laced with warnings, oracles, and thinly veiled threats. She reminded him of his true enemies, challenged the loyalty of his companions, criticized his adoption of Persian customs, his marriages, even his flirtation with divinity. No one else dared speak to him like this. Olympias always had. Back in Macedon, Antipater's resentment grew. She undermined him at every turn, using her status, her religious authority, and her network in Epirus to stir resistance. Olympias had survived palace intrigue before, and she had no intention of losing now, not while her son's empire was still in the making. In Thessaly and among the Macedonian elite, her influence was unmatched. Olympias could launch a rumor with the ease of a sigh, and in her hands a whisper could cut deeper than a blade. Her letters to Alexander grew sharper, more insistent. She painted Antipater as another Philip in the making, an ambitious figure biding his time to betray and seize power. Whether this was her genuine belief or the reflex of a woman unwilling to loosen her grip, she kept urging her son to act. But Alexander hesitated. He needed Antipater to keep Greece stable while he campaigned in Asia, and so the gulf between his mother and his general only deepened. Olympias watched in silence, but behind the mask of piety and maternal devotion, her patience was fraying. She had not survived decades of palace intrigue just to be overshadowed by an aging soldier. As Alexander's empire swelled from the Aegean to the frontiers of India, she saw fault lines forming. He was overextending, trusting too many foreign advisors, and drifting away from the mother and the gods she believed had made him great. In her mind, his triumphs were born of divine favor, and of her. And if he ever forgot that, Olympias knew how to remind even kings of where their power came from, even if that king was her own son. When word reached Macedon in 323 BCE that Alexander had died in Babylon, it came not like the blare of a trumpet but like the thrust of a dagger. For Olympias, it was not merely the loss of her son, it was the shattering of a world she had built over decades. The child she had foretold, nurtured, unleashed upon the world was gone. And he had left behind no single heir, no undisputed successor, only chaos. The empire he carved was already splintering. Generals who once called themselves his brothers in arms were now carving it up like scavengers over a carcass. Antipater still ruled Macedon and Greece, and his dislike of Olympias was no secret. Worse, her daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being pursued by rival warlords seeking to marry into the bloodline for their own claim to power. Olympias saw the writing on the wall. Civil war was not just coming, it was already here. This time, her weapon was not Alexander's sword, but his bloodline. The young Alexander IV, her grandson and the child of Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had wed, was still in Macedon and dangerously exposed. Olympias understood that the boy was both the last living thread of her son's legacy and a pawn of immense value. She allied with Roxana, determined to shield the child and wield his claim as a banner on the battlefield of politics. But the tide had shifted. The generals who had once bent the knee to Alexander now had their own armies, ambitions, and grudges. Olympias did not waver. She had stared down kings and traitors before. A handful of ambitious warlords would not break her. She bided her time, striking only when Antipater died and his son Cassander, a man as cold as steel and with no patience for her defiance, took his place. It was only a matter of time before the serpent mother of Alexander clashed with the hard-eyed usurper who wanted her gone. Alexander might have been dead, but his shadow lingered, and Olympias still coiled within it, ready to strike. Years later, with the empire collapsing into civil war, she made her boldest move yet. Olympias returned to Macedon not as a mourning widow, but as a force of divine vengeance. Cassander had tightened his grip on power, keeping Roxana and young Alexander IV under guard. Olympias knew if she hesitated now, her grandson would vanish into history like a breath in the wind. She struck an alliance with Polyperchon, an aging but still legitimate general, and returned at the head of an army. She did not come to plead, she came to rule. The moment she set foot on Macedonian soil, the ground shifted. Cities flung open their gates. Soldiers abandoned their posts to join her. Even old enemies paused because age had not dulled the fire in Olympias's eyes. Her name could still make the ground tremble. Then came her reckoning. One by one she hunted down Cassander's supporters. When Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, mentally unfit yet propped up as a puppet king, fell into her grasp, she ordered his execution. Ancient accounts say his wife, Eurydice, was captured and offered the chance to take her own life. When she refused, Olympias had her strangled. It was ruthlessness draped in ceremony, justice wrapped in the theater of queenship. Her message was unmistakable. Only Alexander's bloodline had the right to the throne. All others were usurpers. For a brief, blazing moment, Olympias held Macedon in her palm. She had restored her dynasty, punished those who betrayed her, and reminded the kingdom what power looked like when wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. But in Macedon, power was like flame in dry grass. It flared bright, then burned everything around it. Cassander was still out there, patient, calculating. When he returned, it was with overwhelming force. His armies were larger, his coffers deeper, his resolve colder. Her allies melted away. Polyperchon's influence waned. The balance shifted. And Olympias found herself cornered in the coastal stronghold of Pydna, watching her enemies draw tighter with each passing day. She had ignited a blaze, and now Macedon was choking on its smoke. Once the most feared woman in the ancient world, she was besieged, cut off, and surrounded by the son of her oldest rival. But Olympias did not plead. She did not bow. For nearly a year, she withstood the siege like a marble statue of divine wrath. While food dwindled, disease crept in, and her supporters deserted. Even then, she carried herself not as a captive, but as the mother of a god. Cassander hesitated. Striking her down risked outrage. She was still Alexander's mother, wrapped in legend. To kill her was to strike at the myth itself. So he offered her a bargain: surrender and live. Olympias knew better. Royal promises had too often been written in water. Yet hunger was no longer a trial, it was a death sentence. Her garrison broke. The gates opened. Olympias, unbending to her final breath, was handed over to her enemies. Cassander refused to kill her directly. That would be too swift, too clean. Instead, he delivered her to the families of those she had executed, giving them the right to decide her fate. They condemned her. But when the time came, no Macedonian could lift a blade against her. She stood there, frail, old, but unshaken, eyes fixed on them as if seeing their souls. They had grown up with stories of her rituals, her serpents, her visions. She had been the mother of the living god who once ruled the world. Not one dared be the first to strike. So Cassander brought in foreigners, men with no memories of her power, no reverence for her name. They obeyed their orders. And just like that, Olympias fell, not to a fanfare but to silence. Her death ended any real claim Alexander's bloodline had to power. The last spark of an empire built on divine ambition was stamped out. Yet in dying, she left a shadow history could not erase. Olympias perished in dust, unarmed, deserted, but she was no quiet figure of history. She had lived as the Serpent Queen, wielding prophecy like a shield and motherhood like a weapon. Without her, there would have been no divine child, no myth of destiny surrounding Alexander. She had shaped him before the world ever knew his name. And even in death, her legend hissed in the years of history. She spoke in the language of omens, of thunderbolts and lions. It wasn't just ruthless elimination of rivals that cleared the throne for a boy king to rule the known world. Olympias didn't merely bear an empire, she guarded it with teeth and steel. Yet even among the most pitiless rulers of antiquity, she was singular. She didn't lead armies like Cleopatra, nor charge into battle like Boudica. Her war front was more insidious. Poison-laced cups, marriages forged as weapons, whispers through temple corridors and the council of oracles. She knew fear's grip, but even more, she mastered belief. She convinced others her son was touched by the gods, and perhaps she believed it herself. Her enemies named her murderess, sorceress, schemer, and none of it was untrue. Olympias was the sum of a merciless world, one where cunning outweighed compassion, and where mercy was a luxury no queen could indulge. Through the centuries she's been damned and deified, villain to some, visionary to others, but never irrelevant. She lingered over Alexander's legacy like a shadow at the edge of the torchlight, always present, just behind the veil. Perhaps that is where she belonged, not as a grieving mother or a mere footnote in a king's saga, but as the author of her own legend. A woman who wrapped herself in prophecy, slept among serpents and outlived the gods themselves. Her bones long turned to dust, her name endures, coiled in every tale of fierce queens, in every murmur of blood-forged destiny, in every empire spun from myth. She waits in the dark, unseen yet unmistakable. Far from her world, on the sun-scorched island of Crete, just south of today's Heraklion, lies a ruin that feels like a dream carved into stone. Corridors wind endlessly, rooms fold back on themselves, stairways rise to nowhere. Even now it's easy to lose your way. This is Knossos, the heart of the Minoan civilization, and the place that may have inspired one of humanity's most enduring legends, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. Before it was a myth, it was a palace. Raised around 1900 BCE and enlarged over centuries, Knossos was no mere royal residence. It was a city beneath a single roof. Spanning nearly 150,000 square feet, it held over 1,000 chambers, light-filled courts, storehouses, shrines, workshops, and what might have been the world's first flushing toilets. It had running water, multi-story apartments, and complex ventilation. This was not a crude fortress. It was a marvel. To modern archaeologists, its layout looks like organized chaos. To ancient eyes, it may have been pure magic. The man who brought Knossos into modern light was the British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans. In the early 1900s, he unearthed the site and quickly became convinced it was the birthplace of the labyrinth myth. The twisting plan, the symbolic architecture, and the ever-present imagery of bulls, painted, carved, or cast in gold, seemed to whisper of the sacred animal. The bull was the Minoan symbol, and Evans even named the civilization after the mythical king Minos. Whether Minos truly lived or not, the legend is now bound to these ruins. Yet here's the irony: no actual labyrinth has been found, no underground prison, no half-man beast. What stands instead is something stranger. A palace deliberately confusing in its loops and layers, where the further one goes, the more the boundaries between fact and myth dissolve. So we are left to wonder, was the Minotaur born from these stones, or was the palace itself the beast? Knossos may never reveal its truth, but it has mastered the art of making us ask the question. The myth endures, a monstrous man-bull trapped in a maze so intricate none could escape. Save for Theseus, the Athenian hero who conquered the creature and found his way out with the help of a single, unbroken thread. The sly resourcefulness of Princess Ariadne. But where did this tale truly begin, and why a labyrinth at all? The earliest versions speak of King Minos, mighty ruler of Crete, who each year demanded Athens send him 7 boys and 7 girls. These captives were given to the Minotaur, a creature born from divine punishment and human shame. Locked away in an underground maze, the beast became a symbol of the savage truth lurking beneath the polish of power. To the Greeks, Crete had always been a place of wealth, mystery, and unease. Its seafaring Minoan people were elegant yet strange, their customs foreign to mainland eyes. Rituals involved daring feats with bulls, their art showed unfamiliar deities, and their palaces bore no resemblance to Greek strongholds. For a visitor from 1000 BCE, Knossos might have felt like another realm entirely. The bull, sacred in Minoan belief, dominated their imagery. Frescoes depicted young acrobats, men and women alike, springing over charging bulls in ceremonial displays. Stylized bull horns crowned rooftops and altars. Combine that with a sprawling, confusing palace, and the seeds of legend were ready to sprout. But perhaps the Minotaur was never just a monster. Perhaps it was a metaphor. Some historians see in the myth a memory of Cretan dominance over Athens, an era when the city truly did pay tribute to a stronger alien power. The labyrinth could represent the political snare of weaker states, and the Minotaur the raw, unyielding force behind Minoan control. Others read it as something more inward, the labyrinth as the human mind's shadowy depths, the Minotaur as our hidden drives, and Theseus as the self, venturing into darkness, guided only by the thin thread of remembrance. Still, the story in Knossos remained tightly bound. No beast has been found here, no princess to hand us a spool of thread. But maybe there's something more enduring, a myth echoing a history that was itself yearning to become legend. Long before Athens raised marble temples or Sparta forged iron spears, there was the Minoan civilization, one of Europe's earliest centers of sophistication. They did not rule with massive armies but with fleets, trade, and a seeming mastery of design that bordered on the supernatural. At their core stood Knossos, not merely a royal seat, but a hub of culture, ritual, and commerce. From roughly 2600 to 1400 BCE, based on Crete, the Minoans built a maritime network that reached Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the far coasts of Iberia. Their ships sliced across the Mediterranean carrying pottery, saffron, bronze, and luxuries. They fought not for land but for influence, and influence made them rich. What strikes us most about Minoan culture is how different it was from that of their later Greek heirs. Their art celebrated the sea, wildlife, and the flowing grace of the human form, not war nor wrathful gods. Frescoes show dolphins leaping, dancers in motion, and athletes somersaulting over bulls. Their goddesses were powerful figures, often bare-breasted, holding snakes, symbols of fertility, renewal, and protection. At the center of it all, Knossos stood not as a fortified citadel on a hill, but as a vast complex nestled in fertile lowlands. There were no heavy defensive walls, suggesting they felt safe behind their fleets or commanded such respect that attack seemed unlikely. Their architecture spoke of confidence. Multi-story buildings, columned courtyards, intricate plumbing. Yet for all their brilliance, the Minoans left us no deciphered voice. Their main script, linear A, remains unreadable. We do not know their true name for themselves, their king's beliefs, their prayers, or the reality behind Knossos walls. What remains are ruins, vibrant art, and the echoes absorbed by the Mycenaeans and later Greek storytellers. The Minoans were more than builders, they were shapers of enigma. And Knossos was more than stone, it was the living heart of a civilization whose pulse can still be felt, if only in the spaces where history and myth entwine. A civilization that glimmered briefly, like sunlight flashing on the Aegean, before slipping into the depths of history. Yet some say its voice still lingers in the winding halls. To step into Knossos is to step into time itself, layered, intricate, and breathtaking. It isn't merely the size that leaves you stunned, it's the way the place thinks. Rooms open into other rooms, corridors fork and disappear, shafts of light pierce the heart of the structure, and staircases twist into shadow before spilling suddenly into sunlit courts. Straight lines are rare. It's easy to imagine why travelers of old might have whispered about a labyrinth. Knossos was no ordinary palace, it was alive. Spread across roughly 150,000 square feet, it held more than 1,000 chambers, some no larger than closets, others expansive and ceremonial. Every space had a purpose. Storerooms, workshops, sanctuaries, living quarters, audience halls, all carefully arranged around a vast central court that may once have hosted rituals or bull-leaping displays. The palace rose in tiers, sometimes 4 or 5 stories high, shaped by both the natural slope of the land and man-made terraces. Navigating it demanded more than a good sense of direction. You needed instinct, memory, or perhaps a thread like the one Theseus carried. Beneath the seeming confusion lay extraordinary ingenuity. The Minoans engineered natural ventilation, cooling interiors with air shafts and open stairwells. They channeled rainwater through clay piping and enjoyed flushing toilets long before Rome's aqueducts came to be. Among its most famous spaces is the so-called throne room, with an alabaster seat set into the wall, flanked by benches. Griffins prowl in frescoes on the walls, guardians from myth. Was this a priest-king's seat? A goddess's sanctuary? A sacred court? No one can say for certain. And the walls themselves speak in color. Dolphins arc through painted seas above bathtubs. Women in tiered skirts stand with bare chests. Youths soar over the backs of charging bulls. This was more than art. It was a statement of identity, a culture bound to nature, movement, and the sea. Yet the deeper you wander, the more the palace unsettles. Some sections seem built to disorient, as if confusion itself was part of the experience. Perhaps here lies the seed of the labyrinth legend, not as a prison for monsters, but as a structure alive with mystery designed to awe and unsettle. Knossos was not merely a seat of power or administration. It was sacred ground, an architectural embodiment of the Minoan spirit. Unlike the later Greeks, the Minoans left no towering stone temples to named gods. Their faith was woven into the palace itself. Small shrines tucked into corners, pillars rising like silent guardians, stylized bull horns crowning altars and roofs. Everywhere the bull's presence loomed, not as a threat, but as a celebrated force. The famed bull-leaping fresco was no sporting event. It may have been a ritual drama, a sacred act where young men and women danced with danger, a symbolic victory over chaos. Then there are the snake goddess figurines unearthed from storerooms beneath the palace, perhaps the most iconic Minoan relics. Bare-breasted, arms lifted, serpents curling in their grasp, they radiate authority. They are no meek idols but protectors, keepers of fertility, renewal, and life. To the Minoans, snakes embodied rebirth and the liminal space between worlds. The rooms where they were found suggest household shrines, quiet sanctuaries hidden among the palace's bustling corridors. Taken together, the frescoes, the horns, the altars, the winding passageways, the palace becomes something more than stone and plaster. It begins to feel like a living ritual instrument, a place designed to channel belief, to weave the mundane and the sacred into a single endless maze. Knossos was never just a royal residence. It was a meeting place between mortals and the divine. There was no towering, separate temple here because the palace itself was the temple. Its very walls, artwork, and structure were woven into a spiritual worldview where sacred and everyday life blended seamlessly. Myth was laid in stone. A hallway could serve as a path to the gods, and the echoes in its chambers might once have carried whispered prayers. Knossos sheltered more than people. It sheltered gods. For centuries, it stood as a symbol of wealth, creativity, and cultural brilliance. Then, suddenly it was gone. By about 1400 BCE, the palace lay empty, its painted walls fading, and the Minoan civilization, masters of the sea, had slipped away like mist over the Aegean. What happened? Theories are many. Some point to nature's fury. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, erupted in one of the largest explosions the world has seen. The blast likely sent tsunamis crashing into Crete's northern shores, destroying harbors and farmland. Ash clouds may have dimmed the sun, starving crops and disrupting the climate. Knossos survived the initial disaster, but the shock may have shaken its economy, politics, and faith to the core. Others suggest human hands played a role. By 1450 BCE, the rising Mycenaeans from mainland Greece may have taken advantage of Minoan weakness. The evidence hints at a brief Mycenaean occupation. Art became more militaristic. The Minoan script, Linear A, was replaced with Linear B, their own writing system. The palace that once celebrated snake goddesses and bull dancers now spoke a foreign language. Some historians believe this takeover wasn't a single dramatic invasion, but a slow absorption. First through trade, then political influence, and eventually control. Others see the cause in internal strife, uprisings, political decay, or an elite that lost its grip. What's remarkable, however, is the lack of destruction. No mass graves, no burned walls. Knossos didn't fall in a blaze. It faded quietly. The ritual stopped. The halls emptied. Nature reclaimed the stones. By the time Homer sang of Crete in his epics, Knossos was already ancient legend, a half-remembered story of kings, monsters, and mazes. Perhaps that's fitting because its end wasn't marked by one catastrophe, but by the slow, inevitable weight of time. For thousands of years, it lay buried under Cretan soil, a forgotten mound, its myths blurred, its walls hidden beneath olive groves. Until one man followed the whispers of legend. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist with a love of Homeric tales and a flair for drama. In 1900, he purchased the land above the ruins, driven by local reports of strange carved seals and artifacts. When he began to dig, he uncovered a palace so vast, so intricate, and so sophisticated that he became convinced he had found the fabled home of King Minos. The frescoes, the stylized horns, the puzzling layout, Evans saw them all as proof of the labyrinth. But Evans was more than an excavator. He was a storyteller, and not without controversy. He named the builders Minoans, after the mythical king. He reconstructed walls, restored frescoes, and even used reinforced concrete to rebuild sections, a bold move that still sparks debate. To some, he was a visionary, to others he tampered with history. What you see today at Knossos is part ancient ruin, part Evans's reimagining, a blend of archaeology and interpretation, and partly the product of Edwardian imagination. Still, Evans accomplished what no one else had dared. He brought Knossos back into the light. He revealed to Europe a Bronze Age civilization far older than classical Greece, one defined by artistry, mystery, and mastery of the sea. He also uncovered the still unreadable linear A script, raising fresh questions about ancient literacy, language, and the limits of what we can ever know. Evans didn't just dig up stone. He revived a legend. He showed that behind the myth of the labyrinth lay something tangible, intricate, and deeply human. A palace that felt like a maze, a culture that faded into shadow, and a man who lifted the soil to find a story stranger and more beautiful than expected. Knossos had slept for 3 millennia. Evans sounded the bell that roused it. To walk through Knossos today is to move through a language of images. Frescoes, carvings, repeating patterns, symbols are everywhere. But without a Rosetta Stone, the Minoans' main script, linear A, still refuses to speak. Instead of reading their words, we read their world. Painted across plaster, carved into stone, woven into decoration. Their art stands apart in the ancient world. No endless battle scenes, no rows of armored kings. Instead, leaping dolphins, blooming lilies, birds mid-flight, sacred bulls, and graceful human figures dancing or in ritual. Even in moments hinting at danger, there's elegance and rhythm. The Minoans weren't chronicling conquest. They seemed to be celebrating the cycles of life and perhaps a cosmic order. One symbol dominates, the double axe or labrys. It appears in shrines, frescoes, and even etched into stone. Many believe it held religious meaning, perhaps linked to female divinity or celestial cycles. Some scholars suggest the very word, labyrinth, comes from labrys, making the labyrinth not a trap at all, but the house of the double axe, a sacred enclosure. Then there are the horns of consecration, stylized bull horns placed atop walls and altars. These may have marked holy spaces, setting them apart from the everyday. Along with countless images of bulls and depictions of bull leaping, it's clear the animal held deep symbolic weight. Whether as a sign of nature, fertility, chaos, or divine presence remains uncertain. Even the palace's design might carry meaning. Some researchers believe its layout mirrored celestial movements or seasonal patterns, its winding corridors and layered rooms reflecting a journey through life, death, and the underworld, a spiritual maze rather than a prison. Without deciphered texts, though, every interpretation teeters between insight and imagination. The Minoans spoke in symbols, not stories. We can hear their rhythm and see their images, but their full meaning remains just beyond reach, like a thread drifting into legend. Knossos is a ruin, but it doesn't feel lifeless. Its corridors still hum, not with ghosts or gods, but with the echoes of lives, myths, and unanswered questions. Even now, long after its fall, Knossos keeps us in its labyrinth. Tourists roam its halls, archaeologists sift its soil, and writers find fresh inspiration in its shadows. The Minotaur may belong to myth, but the feeling of the labyrinth is real. We don't know the names of Knossos' rulers or priests. We don't know the exact prayers they spoke or the laws they followed. But we know they revered beauty. We know they honored nature. We know they sought balance between architecture and art, ritual and reality. And we know they came first. Before the Parthenon, before Rome, before the Hebrew temples or the Persian palaces, there was Knossos, a palace that was also a city that was also a temple that may also have been perhaps that's the real truth of the labyrinth, not merely a prison nor a puzzle, but a story etched into stone, a myth shaped into architecture. The Minotaur's tale didn't spring from thin air, it was born here, from the disorienting halls, the reverence for the bull, and the wonder it stirred in those who tried to understand it. The Greeks turned it into legend. We transformed it into archaeology. Yet Knossos has always been both. Today we can wander its ruins in daylight, take photographs, chart its plan, even repaint its ancient frescoes. But the enigma remains. The border between history and myth still shimmers, like heat rising off the stones. And maybe that's why Knossos endures, because it doesn't hand us every answer. It reminds us that some histories aren't meant to be solved, but experienced. Knossos, ancient, intricate, half-forgotten, isn't just a location on a map. It's a question, one that pulls us deeper with every step. And like Theseus, we're all still chasing the thread. Ancient engineers, too, knew exactly what they were creating. The earliest battering rams were simple. Just teams of warriors hoisting a heavy log and slamming it into gates like furious lumberjacks. But over time the ram became far more than a crude tool. Builders mounted it within wheeled frames, often roofed to shield crews from arrows and boiling oil, transforming it into an engine of fear. The Assyrians, masters of sieges, took the ram to terrifying heights. Their siege towers combined these smashing beams with platforms for archers, so gates splintered under constant assault while defenders were peppered with arrows. Stone reliefs from Nineveh show rams tipped with iron heads rolling toward rebel cities like slow, unstoppable gods of ruin. And they didn't just target gates. Rams crushed weak points in walls, toppled watchtowers, or brought down entire gateways. Their arrival meant one thing: surrender or watch your defenses collapse like stale bread. The Greeks refined them, the Romans perfected them. Roman engineers built colossal versions called Ares, Latin for ram, suspended by chains inside enormous siege shelters. Some were so massive they needed scores of men to keep them in motion. The beat of their swinging timber was said to rumble like thunder against stone. But brute strength alone wasn't enough. Operating a ram took coordination, keeping its rhythm while shielding it from fire, boulders, and noxious missiles hurled from above. If a ram stopped moving, it was as good as destroyed. Yet once it found its momentum, there was no stopping it. Timber force against masonry, it was ancient physics turned into destruction. And the ram was only the beginning of the engineer's arsenal. If the ram was the brawler, the catapult was the strategist. Where rams struck up close, catapults rained destruction from afar, hurling not just stones but fear. They were the earliest true artillery, changing siegecraft forever by turning physics into something that seemed almost magical to those on the receiving end. The first catapults emerged in the Greek world in the 4th century BCE, the work of minds seeking more range and power in war. Dionysius I of Syracuse, a ruler with a taste for innovation in weaponry, commissioned the first torsion-powered designs, which used tightly twisted bundles of sinew or hair as springs. These weren't giant toys, they were precision siege machines. The brilliance was in their mechanics. By twisting the rope bundles to extreme tension, engineers stored massive potential energy. When released, it could launch stones, javelins, or even fireballs hundreds of meters. Two main designs took shape quickly: the ballista, a massive crossbow-like engine that shot heavy bolts, and the stone-throwing catapult, capable of lobbing boulders over walls or directly into fortifications. Then came the Romans. Roman engineers, famous for never finding a Greek invention they couldn't refine, took siegecraft to the next level. They built catapults that broke down into parts, could be hauled on carts, and reassembled right where they were needed. These portable war machines suited the disciplined mobility of their legions. Some were powerful enough to hurl 60-pound stones at tremendous velocity, smashing through gates, battlements, and sometimes unfortunate defenders. But the catapult wasn't just about destruction. It was a performance. Commanders used them to send both messages and mayhem. Corpses could be launched into cities to spread panic and disease, while severed heads served as grim calling cards. In particularly ruthless campaigns, diseased bodies were fired into enemy lands as a primitive form of biological warfare. Still, catapults had weaknesses. They were bulky, demanded trained crews, and were useless on bad terrain. Yet, when positioned well, they could pummel a settlement into surrender from beyond the reach of arrows. For the first time, cities realized their massive walls had to guard against threats not just at the gate, but from the sky, because now death could fall from above. If the catapult was the cunning tactician, the trebuchet was the monarch. Towering, groaning, and awe-inspiring, it reigned as the supreme siege engine of the Middle Ages. When one appeared on the field, it didn't just threaten, it declared, "Your walls mean nothing." Unlike the torsion-driven catapult, the trebuchet's heart was gravity itself. A long arm pivoted on a sturdy frame, with a huge counterweight on one end and a sling on the other. Lift the weight, let it fall, and the arm whipped around, hurling its payload high and far over enemy lines. The design was elegant, predictable, and devastating. Its roots stretched back to traction trebuchets used in China as early as the 4th century BCE, powered by teams of men instead of weights. But the counterweight trebuchet, the game-changer for Europe and the Islamic world, arrived in the 12th century, likely via Byzantine or Muslim innovation. Once Europeans adopted it, the design spread through castle sieges and crusades with astonishing speed. The power was staggering. A masterfully built trebuchet could lob 300-pound stones over 300 meters. Rocks the size of tables could shatter towers, pulverize walls, and crush morale. And the high, arcing shot meant it could strike not only defenses but also inner courtyards, troop quarters, and supply caches. Its projectiles weren't limited to stone. Engineers flung rotting carcasses, jars of burning pitch, lime powder to blind defenders, and even written taunts wrapped around rocks. One famous tale from the siege of Stirling Castle tells of Warwolf, a trebuchet so enormous the defenders surrendered before it fired. The king refused their plea, he wanted to see it in action. Yet the trebuchet had its limits. Construction was slow, reloading took minutes, and skilled crews were essential. But nothing else in medieval warfare combined range, raw impact, and psychological terror quite like it. When that counterweight dropped, it was as if the sky itself was attacking. While catapults struck from a distance and rams broke gates, siege towers took the fight right to the walls. Imagine a rolling wooden fortress, multi-storied, armored with soaked hides against fire, and bristling with archers and spearmen. These giants rumbled toward the defenses, ready to unload soldiers directly onto the battlements. Siege towers were blunt in purpose, huge, conspicuous, and fearsome when used correctly. The Assyrians may have pioneered them in the 9th century BCE, but it was the Greeks, and especially the Hellenistic kingdoms, took siege tower design to almost theatrical extremes. In 305 BCE, during the siege of Rhodes, the Macedonian commander Demetrius unveiled a 9-story monster known as the Helepolis, taker of cities. This towering behemoth stood over 100 feet tall, clad in iron plates, bristling with catapults, and pushed into place by thousands of men. Its sheer bulk was so great that it eventually damaged itself under its own weight, but the audacity was unmatched. The principle behind siege towers was straightforward. Walls only defend a city if enemies can't get over them. Towers neutralized that advantage by providing a mobile platform level with, or even above, the battlements. From their upper decks, archers could blanket defenders in arrows, while soldiers on lower levels prepared to storm the walls. Still, these machines had vulnerabilities. They moved at a crawl, bogged down in mud, and made tempting targets for defenders armed with flaming arrows, rolling stones, or even sabotaged ground. Clever defenders dug ditches, flooded moats, or built secondary inner barriers, called counterscarp defenses, to halt their advance. But when a tower reached the walls intact, the effect was devastating. Suddenly the defenders' own ramparts were crowded with enemy troops, turning defense into desperate close combat. Siege towers changed warfare from a flat contest of strength to a vertical struggle for survival. And once the gangplank dropped, there was no retreat, only brutal face-to-face battle. While rams smashed gates and trebuchets rained destruction from afar, some of the most ruinous tactics happened silently, out of sight, beneath the earth. Known as siege tunneling or sapping, this was the grim science of defeating a fortress by erasing the ground beneath it. The concept was ancient. Dig under the wall, support the excavation with timber, then set the supports on fire. Once the beams burned away, the tunnel collapsed, taking the wall's foundation with it. In an instant, what seemed like an unshakable defense crumbled into rubble. There was no grandeur here, no massive engines or spectacular launches, just slow, hidden, relentless destruction. Early versions appeared with the Assyrians, but the Greeks, Persians, and later medieval engineers perfected the technique. At the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, Spartan miners tried to dig under the walls, only to have defenders counter-dig toward them. When the tunnels met, the darkness erupted into vicious, close-quarters fighting, a desperate form of underground warfare known as counter-mining. Soldiers hacked at each other by torchlight in stifling heat, armed with knives, picks, and shovels. When undermining succeeded, it was catastrophic. In 1215, during the siege of Rochester Castle in England, King John's troops tunneled under a quay wall, packed the mine with pig fat, and set it alight. The supports burned away, the wall collapsed, and with it an entire tower, forcing a stunned surrender. By the 13th century, sappers were part engineer, part geologist, and part demolition expert, calculating soil stability, finding weak points, and orchestrating collapses with chilling precision. Tunneling was grueling, filthy, and deadly, but it proved a brutal truth of siegecraft. If you couldn't climb the wall or smash through it, you could always make it fall from underneath. Of course, attackers weren't the only ones bringing ingenuity to the fight. For every battering ram rolled forward, defenders had their own fearsome countermeasures, and some were as spectacular as they were deadly. Few matched the terror of Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantines in the 7th century CE, this mysterious, napalm-like weapon could cling to hulls, fortifications, and even human skin, continuing to burn while floating on water. Delivered through siphons or thrown in ceramic jars, it turned battlefields, especially naval ones, into scenes of utter chaos. The exact formula remains lost to history. The Byzantines guarded it so fiercely that it vanished along with their empire. But its reputation endured, entire fleets reduced to flaming wreckage within moments. Not all defensive weapons relied on such mystery. Boiling liquids were the classic, tried-and-true deterrent. From openings in the ceilings of gates or towers, known as murder holes, defenders would pour scalding water, oil, or even heated sand down onto attackers. Oil was dreaded above all. Unlike water, it clung to armor and fabric, soaking in before igniting into an inescapable blaze. Hot sand, while less dramatic, was cruel in its own way, slipping into armor gaps around necks and wrists, inflicting deep burns that cooked the skin beneath. It wasn't flashy, but it was devastating, turning charging warriors into writhing, screaming casualties in seconds. Gravity itself was a weapon. Defenders heaved massive stones, sharpened logs, or even carcasses over the parapets, aiming not only to crush soldiers but to smash siege machines and sap enemy morale. Some fortresses went further, laying hidden pitfalls, rigging collapsible bridges, or erecting spiked barricades. Fortified mazes designed to delay, confuse, and punish. Delay was everything. Every hour the walls held meant dwindling enemy supplies, spreading camp diseases, and a growing risk of reinforcements arriving. Siege warfare was a slow grind, and while attackers had engineering might, defenders wielded creativity and a generous supply of boiling rage. In siegecraft, destruction was only half the battle. The other half was psychological warfare, shattering the enemy's will before the walls even fell. Siege weapons were more than tools. They were towering, creaking, flaming symbols of inevitability. Every groan of a siege tower's wheels, every rock arcing from a trebuchet whispered the same message: you are not safe. Ancient armies understood the theater of fear. The Assyrians would march their siege engines across open deserts for all to see, turning the approach itself into a show of force. The Romans built siege camps in plain view, letting defenders watch as massive rams and catapults took shape. Sometimes the projectiles themselves were messages, severed heads of envoys or fallen commanders hurled over the walls, still clad in armor. At the siege of Constantinople, defenders endured not only boulders but also volleys of corpses, some diseased, hurled to spread sickness and dread. During the Mongol assault on Kaffa in 1346, plague-ridden bodies were catapulted into the city, an act some historians believe helped unleash the Black Death across Europe. The trebuchet wasn't merely a weapon, it was an omen. Its presence was announced long before it fired. The groan of winches, the grind of ropes, the deep thunk of the counterweight, each sound like the drumbeat of an approaching storm. The most unnerving part was the uncertainty. Would the next shot be a boulder? A jar of flaming pitch? A bundle of arrows? Or nothing at all, just that suffocating silence as engineers recalibrated for the next strike? Even sound became a weapon. The steady pounding of a ram or the sudden absence of noise gnawed at defenders' nerves. The true aim was despair, making defenders believe their gods had abandoned them, that their walls were temporary, and that surrender was the only rational choice. When that mental barrier gave way, the gates often opened without a fight. In siege warfare, sometimes the mind collapsed long before the stonework. By the late medieval period, the era of classic siege engines was splintering to a close. But their influence didn't disappear, it transformed. The arrival of cannons rewrote the rules of war. With a single thunderous blast, a well-aimed cannon could shatter stonework in moments, accomplishing in seconds what a trebuchet might labor at for hours. Fortifications once deemed unassailable were suddenly vulnerable. By the 1400s, Europe's grand castles were falling, not to fire or undermining, but to iron shots smashing straight through their walls. Siegecraft had entered a new chapter, explosive, brutal, and deafening. Yet the wisdom of ancient siege engineers didn't fade. Modern artillery owes its very existence to the principles of catapults and trebuchets. Every missile, mortar, and howitzer is just a refined answer to the same ancient challenge. How do you destroy the indestructible from a safe distance? The fundamentals, trajectory, force, tension, and impact, were mastered long before gunpowder ever roared onto the battlefield. Even the psychology remains unchanged. Today's shock and awe is simply the modern version of those colossal siege towers rumbling forward under banners snapping in the wind. Then as now, the objective wasn't only to breach a wall, it was to shatter morale before the first stone fell. You can still read their story in the scars of history. At Masada, Roman siege ramps still cut across the desert landscape. In Constantinople, layered fortifications withstood 1,000 years of attacks before finally succumbing to the relentless pounding of cannons. Cross. Europe, round towers and angled bastions speak of an arms race between builders and breakers, each redesign born from the memory of the last siege. And while the tools have changed, drones, satellite-guided munitions, cyber attacks, the essence of the siege endures. Cities are still surrounded. Defenders are still cut off. The walls may now be digital, firewalls, blockades, even media blackouts, but the struggle is the same. One side determined to get in, the other determined to hold them out. The battering rams have rotted away. The trebuchets rest in museums. But the spirit of siege warfare, patient, relentless, and devastating, remains very much alive.